This is the fourth and final segment in our short series covering the expiration of the home regulatory waivers and statutory suspensions issued by HUD in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. If you've accessed this recording from the HUD Exchange, the other segments can be accessed from the same page. If you're watching this directly on YouTube, there are links in the description below the video to the other segments, as well as to other related HUD resources. Early in the pandemic, HUD provided extraordinary flexibility to allow PJs to develop home-funded emergency tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA programs. The statutory suspensions and regulatory waivers were covered in a separate memo by HUD, issued initially in April of 2020 and extended and revised in another memo issued in December of 2020. All of the emergency TBRA-focused waivers and suspensions expired as of the end of September 2021, and PJs should have reverted to regular home requirements for any TBRA provided past that date. For the next few minutes, we'll discuss the expired waivers and briefly summarize the regular requirements to help PJs and their TBRA partners make sure they're addressing all of the regular home requirements applicable to TBRA activities that are now underway. First group of waivers related to administrative aspects of home TBRA and were intended to help PJs rapidly develop and deploy emergency TBRA programs. First, HUD waived the requirement that a PJ certify that rental assistance is an essential element of its consolidated plan. In the early days of the pandemic, with millions out of work, HUD essentially accepted that any PJ could determine there was a pressing need for TBRA assisting households affected by the pandemic. The second waiver was also intended to speed implementation and allow PJs to reduce the notice period for substantial amendments to only 5 days rather than the typical 30. While PJs still needed to do substantial amendments when deploying new programs or making significant changes in the allocation of home funds across different activity types, this waiver allowed PJs to move more quickly in the early months of the pandemic. Finally, HUD waived the requirement that PJs develop written selection criteria for their TBRA programs, which also allowed PJs to move more quickly, though they were still expected to have transparent policies and procedures, among other things, providing for transparent and consistent treatment of applicants. The next group of waivers was rooted to a large degree in the public health situation at the time. HUD allowed PJs to elect a waiver of the standard income documentation requirements, which require income determinations to be documented with at least 2 months of source documentation, like pay stubs, bank statements, and the like, and instead to rely on self-certifications from emergency TBRA applicants, many of whom were not able to come into offices that were closed during the pandemic. HUD also waived the requirement for HQS inspections, which normally are required prior to executing a TBRA agreement and lease, and also waived the requirement for annual re-inspections when a TBRA tenant remains in a unit. Note that lead-based paint provisions were never waived, so in some cases, visual paint assessments were still required. All of the other TBRA-specific waivers expired on September 30th. The waiver of annual re-inspections did apply for inspections that would otherwise have been regularly required through December 31st of 2021. Finally, the other TBRA waivers were centered around assistance levels and lease requirements. To facilitate emergency TBRA for tenants who already occupied their units, HUD waived the standard requirement that TBRA rental assistance and the tenant's lease both start on the same day. Anticipating that tenants already in units but needing assistance due to the loss of income would already have a lease, and anticipating that requiring it be modified in order to receive assistance might discourage participation by property owners and delay the delivery of much needed assistance, HUD also waived regular requirements from 92-253A and B that otherwise require certain elements to a lease and prohibit various lease provisions. Remember, though, that even in emergency TBRA, a tenant did need to have a written lease, and the PJ was still responsible for ensuring that that lease included appropriate VAWA provisions. Under the emergency TBRA waivers, HUD also allowed PJs to pay up to 100% of rent and to pay for a tenant's utilities that weren't otherwise included in their rent. This was different from normal TBRA rules, where PJs can only fund rent assistance up to the difference between the PJ's payment standard and 30% of the tenant's adjusted income. The regular or standard TBRA approach also allows a PJ to assist with a tenant's security deposit either alone or in concert with ongoing rent assistance. And in markets where utility deposits are required, a PJ can use TBRA towards those utility deposits, provided it is also providing either ongoing rent assistance or security deposit assistance to the tenant. Simply put, you can't do a utility deposit alone TBRA program. Finally, the emergency TBRA memo also waived the regular requirement that the PJ conduct a rent reasonableness review. Again, this was intended to both address situations where tenants already had a lease and to facilitate quicker delivery of assistance.
Since the emergency TBRA waivers expired on September 30th, 2021, any PJ that had an emergency TBRA program using the home COVID-19 waivers should have already ended that assistance program. However, we recognize that tenant needs related to the pandemic did not end with the expiration of the waivers. PJs have been urged to consider transitioning households to regular TBRA programs, either existing programs or new ones created to respond to evolving needs. If transitioning to a regular program, PJ should be aware that any such transition is subject to consolidated plan requirements, and emergency TBRA tenants that are being transitioned will have to be processed as new applicants for regular TBRA assistance following all regular TBRA requirements, including certifications, contracts, leases, and inspections. Other forms of tenant assistance beyond home were made available during the pandemic, such as the Treasury Department's Emergency Rental Assistance Program. These programs might still be available to assist households for now, but PJs might need to re-examine the need for home TBRA in the future as these temporary sources expire. Finally, we want to remind you that TBRA is an eligible activity under Home ARP. Home ARP has waivers and alternative requirements that apply only to Home ARP. They do not apply to regular home TBRA, which must follow the regular requirements of the Home Final Rule. This concludes the four-part series on home COVID-19 waivers. We urge you to continue to monitor the HUD Exchange for updates and additional resources. Also be sure that you are on the HUD home mailing list that can be accessed at the link on your screen. If you have any further questions, PJ should contact their field office, and PJ partners such as owners, managers, and subrecipients with questions should contact their PJ. Thank you.